All right, today we're looking at standard 8.1b. This is the second part of the civil rights section. If you missed the beginning of it, you might want to go back and take a look at 8.1a. We're going to look at presidential roles in advancing the civil rights movement. We're going to look at civil rights in the South and how it progresses there, and then we'll take a little look at what happens in the North in the 60s with the civil rights movement, and hopefully we'll get you up to speed. So we mentioned this in the last video, but right after the Second World War, Harry Truman is very frustrated with the fact that returning soldiers are being beaten, sometimes lynched, in the South. And so Truman says we've got to do something. One of the ways that he can start to desegregate the nation is by desegregating the military so black and white soldiers fight together. Now, that's a great plan, except that it really upsets Southern white racists. This is interesting because after the Civil War, if you remember, Southerners stopped voting for the Republican Party 100%. Actually, they never had, because Lincoln shows up at the beginning and says, I'm a Republican, vote for me, and then he ends slavery. So the South has never voted Republican. They've always been hardcore Democrat. But now Truman's a Democrat. And Truman says, I am not going to allow these kinds of things to continue. Let's desegregate the military. So the Democrats in the South don't want to continue voting Democrat. Now, neither do they want to vote Republican because they're still bitter about Lincoln almost 100 years later. And so some Southern Democrats start voting for a party that they created called the Dixiecrats. Basically, these are Democrats that don't like desegregation. They don't like integration of the races. And they're not going to win a whole lot, but this shows you what lengths they're willing to go to maintain their segregation in the South. President Eisenhower comes after Truman, and Eisenhower is going to be one of the, well, really the first president to use federal troops to force integration. There's a school in Little Rock, Arkansas, where 9 black students are supposed to attend, and the people of the town and the governor of the state want to prevent it from happening. And so Eisenhower has troops, like thousands of troops, show up to keep the town in order and escort the kids to school. This is a big deal because the federal government is now saying we're going to do whatever we have to do, including using troops to encourage civil rights in the United States. John F. Kennedy does a very similar thing when a former soldier, a guy by the name of James Meredith, wants to enroll at the University of Mississippi. It had been totally segregated. James Meredith comes in, the University of Mississippi turns him down, and so John F. Kennedy sends in the National Guard. Of course, the South is livid. This really frustrates them, but it shows that segregation is coming to an end. When Kennedy dies, President Johnson, Lyndon Johnson, is going to continue this idea of forward movement on civil rights issues, and he signs 2 very important civil rights laws. One is the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which outlaws all kinds of discrimination at work and public facilities, almost anywhere that gets any kind of government money. And the Voting Rights Act of 1965. This Voting Rights Act takes away the idea of, or says you can't use a poll tax, remember paying a little tax to vote, and you can't use literacy tests like had been used in the South to keep black people from voting. This is another major blow to the South. The South has tried to maintain the status quo, which in their mind is racism, segregation, since the end of the Civil War, and now the government is coming in and just sweeping all that away. Nixon, though, is going to do something very different. Nixon comes after Johnson, but Nixon realizes that the South is not happy at all with the Democrats, and Nixon is a Republican. He says, this is my opportunity. Sure, they hated Lincoln, but Lincoln was more than 100 years ago by this point. It's 1968 that Nixon's going to run. So Nixon says, with his Southern strategy is what he uses. The Southern strategy is this idea that where he says, it's not the job of the federal government to tell the states how to enforce these laws. So it's a mistake, Nixon says, to use, for example, the National Guard to force states into letting black students go to school with white students. Well, the Democrats in the South, former Democrats in the South, love this idea. because the Democrats haven't helped them out at all lately. So now they say, well, let's vote for Nixon. That's his strategy in the South to get the South to vote for him. And the South does. The Republican Party wins in the South overwhelmingly, and the South leans heavily Republican to this day. I'm not saying the South is still racist, or white people who are Republican in the South are racist, but some of the roots of why the shift happens politically and the South starts voting Republican are right here with Nixon's Southern strategy. So how does the civil rights movement itself work? We've got presidents helping out, but what are the actual leaders of the movement going to do? Well, what guys like Martin Luther King would do is that they would watch the news, they would read the newspaper, and they would see where are the places in the country where the most nasty, vicious racism exists. And then they would go there. But they wouldn't go alone. They'd bring the news media, they'd bring the TV cameras, and they'd bring the film crews, and they'd bring the reporters. And so when they go and they have peaceful marches in some of these cities, and then the fire hoses get turned on them like you see down here at the bottom, or when the police come and start dragging people away, or I know my video is covering this up, but when the police dogs start attacking innocent black men, the nation as a whole is starting to see that something's wrong. TV plays a huge role here because when you sit down to watch the 6 o'clock news, you don't expect to see innocent people being beaten or hosed, but now you are. And you think, we've got to do something to change this. The idea is to shock the country into ending segregation and inequality. And I think largely it's going to succeed. So how is Martin Luther King, now why is it that he gets so much press? Why do we have a whole day for him? Well, the biggest reason for it is that he is an organizer in this movement and he's the spokesman. Martin Luther King is a very powerful speaker, as you no doubt know from speeches like I Have a Dream. He is also able to take this movement where you've got some people who want to continue the nonviolent approach and others who want to fight and kill white people. And he is able to use his power and his presence to get these sides to work together and to continue in the nonviolent path. This is huge. Because if people had decided to get violent in the 1960s, I think we'd have a very different nation as a whole today. And so we really owe him a debt of gratitude. One of the most famous stories of this nonviolent approach is the Montgomery bus boycott. You know the story of Rosa Parks, who refuses to give up her seat for a white man. Now, she's not the first black woman to refuse to give up her seat for a white man. In reality, this isn't even the first time that Rosa Parks has been arrested or kicked off a bus for failing to give up her seat to a white man. The reason that this time is different is that it's planned. She's a secretary for the NAACP there in Montgomery, and so when she's arrested, they use the news media, like they've been doing in other venues, to come out and report on the fact that this little lady, this sweet lady, you can see in the picture, is arrested just because she was tired and didn't want to give up her seat. Well, because this is now the 60s and we're mobilizing, these the people from the civil rights movement show up in Montgomery and organize a bus boycott. They say, we're going to stop using the bus. And that's a huge deal because most of the people who rode the bus in Montgomery, Alabama were black. And so now 80% of the people who used to ride the bus aren't riding the bus. This boycott lasts for almost a year until finally the Supreme Court gets involved and rules that not allowing black people to choose their own seats is a violation of the 14th Amendment. If you're keeping score, that's the same amendment they used to say that Linda Brown could go to school at the white school. She didn't have to go to the black school, so that schools could be integrated. So the 14th Amendment is going to be a major factor in getting rid of discrimination in the United States. Well, so some people want to test this out and see if the South as a whole is going to be willing to allow mixed bus riders. So we organize the Freedom Rides, where you get white people and black people sitting together on a bus in one seat. All right, so maybe I'd sit right next to a black person, and then we'd have a white and a black person behind us. And we'd drive into some of these very, very racist cities, trying to test how tolerant they are. And you can see the pictures here. The result is that buses are burned, people are beaten, both black and white. And so the South is still doing everything it can do to cling on to its old ways of life. One of the most famous cities where Martin Luther King goes to organize is Birmingham, Alabama. I don't really need to talk a lot about this in particular because this is very, very similar to what he does in other cities, but this is maybe the most famous. Martin Luther goes to Birmingham, Alabama. Martin Luther King goes to Birmingham, Alabama, and he organizes sit-ins and marches and boycotts, all for the purpose of drawing attention to this racism. You see down the picture below where, again, they turn on the fire hoses onto, in this case, many of those are teenagers. They arrest a lot of teenagers, and they go to jail for marching peacefully. And so this national attention and pressure just calls the nation as a whole to do something. We can't let this stand. 1964, a number of upper and middle class white college students from the North decided to go into the South, to Mississippi again, to register black people to vote. And you would think that that wouldn't be so controversial, but of course it's seen as outsiders coming in and telling the South what to do. And as a result, you end up with some dead white college students in Mississippi. So everything that's happening is highlighting how drastic the South, what drastic steps the South is willing to take to maintain their way of life, but also now people are seeing how incredibly racist they are. So in 1965, you have a march that's organized in Alabama. A number of marchers are going to go from Selma, Alabama to Montgomery, Alabama. It's about 50 miles. It would take roughly 4 days to march. And this march, when they get to Montgomery, they want to register to vote. And when they get to the outside of Selma, so just the beginning of town, there's a bridge there called the Edmund Pettus Bridge. You don't have to know that, but anyway. And the police are waiting on that bridge, and they say, go home. To continue this march would be detrimental to your health. Well, boy, that sounds kind of like a threat, doesn't it? Well, the marchers don't go anywhere. And they repeat, you need to go home, you need to go to your churches, you need to leave. And when they don't, the police put on their gas masks, they start moving into the crowd with their billy clubs, they ride horses into the crowds, they shoot tear gas into the crowd, and they violently break up this march. Well, this too is captured on television. And so within days, Lyndon Johnson pushes the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Remember, that's the one I mentioned a while ago that basically says that there cannot be any poll tax, there cannot be any literacy tests. Black people need to be able to vote. And that comes as a direct result of this march, because if you see pictures like this on the news, you think something is wrong and something must be done. This guy here in particular in the front, his name is John Lewis. John Lewis goes on to become a United States congressman. So I think you sense a certain amount of pride just by seeing that kind of thing. I'm actually going to stop here because we're 13 minutes in. The next section is very neat. Next we talk about civil rights in the North. It's a much shorter section. So join us again for 8.1b, Part 2. If you have any questions, as always, shoot me an email.